Good afternoon, everybody. We have learned in this course that genocide is a precise term, and it's one that demands rather stringent conditions. It's also a term that has been politicized because, as we know, once a conflict or event is identified as a genocide, it calls forth responsibility. It demands an appropriate response. As we know, it is difficult to obtain a consensus on what is and isn't genocide. So we have horrific conflicts going on in the world as I speak that ostensibly remain just that, conflicts. None of them will be pinned as a genocide anytime soon. That is a political decision because one man's genocide is another man's crime against humanity. It is no less essential that we study and understand these tragedies. Dr. Kerry Whigham is with us today to speak to us of the long night of the generals, the horror that afflicted Argentina from 1976 to 1983. Argentina is a different kind of topic for this lecture series. While the terror of the dirty war does not fit the precise definition of genocide, because the UN Convention omits the category of a political class, it is a very important case for anyone who wants to understand how a civil society can recover and move forward after suffering the brutality of its own government. This critical question of how a nation can heal from this kind of trauma, how it can grapple with something like the disappeared ones, is important for all of the genocides we consider in this course, and most notably, or appropriately, for Rwanda, Bosnia, and Cambodia. Dr. Whigham received his doctorate in performance studies at New York University. He has published articles in Genocide Studies and Prevention, the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, and many others. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. He also participates in the faculty consortium of Stockton University's program in Genocide Studies, and he's a visiting scholar at Rutgers Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights. Kerry also works as the academic program officer for the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. Please welcome Dr. Kerry Whigham.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Diane, and thank you all for being here. Especially, I hear this is the first Tuesday after spring break, and it's also beautiful outside, so I appreciate you being here inside with me today. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the ancestral territory of the Coast Miwok people. The Coast Miwok, like all indigenous people in this country, are themselves victims and survivors of genocide, and I want to express my gratitude for being on their land today. And I also want to thank Diane and all of her team at Sonoma State University and the Center for the Study of Holocaust and Genocide for inviting me back. From 1976 to 1983, the people of Argentina lived under one of the most repressive and violent military dictatorships of the 20th century. Over a 7-year period, the right-wing military junta that seized power in March of 1976 carried out its process of national reorganization, which was colloquially known as El Proceso, just the process, which sought to eliminate everyone deemed to be a subversive leftist element from the country. This effort led to the torture, death, and disappearance of some 30,000 Argentinian citizens who were kidnapped by the military police and taken to clandestine detention centers that were spread all across the country. When the families of the victims went to the state to find out what happened to their relatives, many times they would discover that all evidence of their relatives' existence had been completely erased. The government acted as if these desaparecidos, or disappeared persons, never existed to begin with. So I was invited here today to speak about my research on this violence that occurred in Argentina during its last military dictatorship, a period which some call a dirty war, others a politicide, and others, including myself, a genocide. And I'll respond to the very prescient point that Diane brought up regarding that term. I'm sure you're already familiar with one essential concept in genocide studies, namely the understanding that genocides are not just events, that happen overnight, but rather they are long social and political processes that begin with much smaller steps within which victim groups are constructed and ostracized in a way that gradually and incrementally constructs a world in which mass killing can take place. Well, what I hope to show today is that one of the reasons Argentina is such a fascinating case is that not only does it illustrate the reality that genocide doesn't happen overnight, that it involves many stages in which various individuals take advantage of various factors in order to destroy certain groups, but it also demonstrates the fact that dealing with the enduring effects of that violence is an equally long and intensive process. And what for me is especially exciting about Argentina is the way it shows how the process of coming to terms with a violent past is not always and only the responsibility of state or government actors. In the case of Argentina, it was everyday citizens, what in academic or governmental parlance we refer to as civil society, that has made the biggest difference and has had the most lasting impact in the way that Argentina has dealt with its genocidal past. And I know that the theme of this semester of lectures is regarding survivors and rescuers. And those two terms definitely have a role to play in my talk today. The survivors of this violence, as you'll see, played an immense role in leading that change, that charge for transformation in the way that the Argentine society deals with its past. But also, I'm going to ask you to reframe a little bit the way that we think about rescuers, because I think there's also something important to acknowledge about people who rescue the past and memory of the past from potential oblivion. And that's an equally important form of rescue that has to happen in post-atrocity societies, especially as all of the social and political forces are saying, let's just move forward and forget about what occurred in the past. So my plan today is first I'm going to explain the steps that led to the perpetration of genocide in Argentina. Then I'm going to break down some of the mechanisms of violence that were developed and implemented during this period. And then finally, I want to paint a picture of the inspiring and creative ways that Argentinian society, both with and without the support of the state, has addressed its own violent past to create a present and a future that is far less likely to repeat this painful history. But before I go any further, I should articulate one caveat and outline one idea that's really central to my work and the way that I approach not only this event in Argentina, but all genocides I study. So I'll start with the caveat, and it's relating to definitions. I refer to the violence that occurred during Argentina's last military dictatorship as a genocide, but not everyone considers it as such. And indeed, as Diane pointed out, if we only go by the definition laid out in the UN Genocide Convention, Argentina would not be classified as a genocide because the victim group was a political group, and that's not one of the protected groups. However, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't feel so beholden to use this legal definition. So for several reasons, I prefer the definition outlined by Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide in 1944. And Lemkin writes that genocide, generally speaking, genocide is intended to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So as you can see here, Lemkin already, in his use of the term national groups, it's a much more open-ended definition of what groups could be protected or are considered protected groups within this definition of genocide, and it leaves space for political groups to be included. But then Lemkin goes on to write, the objectives of such a plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. I really like this part of the definition because here Lemkin highlights all of the myriad ways that genocidal violence can function other than the physical destruction of groups. Groups can be destroyed through any number of the destruction of social institutions, cultural practices, economic structures, and these forms of annihilation can also have an enduring effect on victim groups as the physical, and just like the physical destruction of the groups obviously has an enduring impact. And this brings me to the second point I want to highlight before I delve into the specifics of Argentina. For me, the violence of genocide doesn't only have this physical force, but it also has this social and affective or emotional force. And this social and emotional force is what allows for the physical destruction of groups to occur in the first place. So for instance, we can think about the culture of anti-Semitism in Europe that the Nazis took advantage of and cultivated in order to justify the Holocaust. But it also does not, that physical or that affective force doesn't just disappear when the physical violence ends. So for instance, when the concentration camps were liberated at the end of World War II and the Allied forces defeated the Axis powers, it's not the physical killing of these victim groups ended, but it's not as if the hatred and all of those social forces that allowed for that physical destruction to begin with, it's not as if that just disappeared overnight. This social and affective force continues to perform or to resonate long into the future, and that's why I call it resonant violence, these resonating forms of violence. And if this more obscure, less visible form of violence is not also addressed, then it can continue to manifest in other forms of violence against victim groups, like enduring social inequality, institutional discrimination, or economic disparities among groups. To understand this, we can just think about some of the demographic differences that exist today between white Americans, for instance, and black Americans or Native Americans. But the good news is that this resonant violence, when it is recognized, can indeed be dealt with, and it can be transformed into new forms of power and political agency. And that, I argue, is exactly what happened and is happening in Argentina. But before we go into this more optimistic place, we need to take a step backwards. And we need to look at the violence that preceded that transformation. And to do that, we can't just start with the military dictatorship of 1976 to 1983. We have to look at the various factors that led to that dictatorship and that allowed for the large-scale perpetration of violence that would take place during that 7-year period. So if you had been in Argentina at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, it would have been really difficult for you to believe or imagine that this country would be one that would perpetrate within decades the levels of violence we saw between 1976 and 83. See, they're doing tango in the streets. That's how nice it was. At the beginning of this period, Argentina was a major site of European immigration. It was second only to New York City as the site that saw the most immigration from Europe during this period. By 1908, it was the 7th wealthiest developed country in the world, and it's important to point out this developed designation because today Argentina is categorized as a developing nation. So it's one of the few cases we have where a country went backwards from being a developed country to a developing country. It was top 5 in world exports. It had a higher per capita income than Denmark, Canada, and the Netherlands. And it had a higher literacy rate than most countries in Latin America would see even 50 years later. So what happened? How did it go from being this developed and really thriving, economically thriving and culturally thriving society into the sort of place that could perpetrate the levels of violence that we saw? Well, several factors contributed to creating an environment that will allow for the perpetration of genocide, and they all really started with the world economic crisis that began in 1929 and the Great Depression. So the Great Depression happens, the whole world goes into crisis, and this is really the beginning of things turning backwards in Argentina. The economic instability created by this crisis led to a series of military coups. So during each of which the military would seize control in order to bring order, economic order to Argentina. So before the coup of 1976, which is the main one we're talking about today, there were 5 other military coups in the 20th century. So there's a history of when things get too tricky, a little unstable, the military has a history of coming in and taking control. So that already becomes normalized in some way. Throughout these military coups, we see the establishments of increasing levels of what Argentinian sociologist Guillermo O'Donnell calls bureaucratic authoritarian regimes. What's a bureaucratic authoritarian regime? It's a system of government that's controlled by and balanced towards the economic elite. It involves the suppression of citizenship and practices of citizenship and the exclusion of civil society from the public sphere. And it's also directed towards privatization of the economy and the establishment, again, of economic order, which really means a sort of neoliberal economic system, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Throughout these coups, we also see the establishment and the normalization of political oppression and the torture of political opponents. So that becomes normalized and acceptable over time. Even in the coup before the one that we're talking about, they started using, for instance, electric cattle prods to get information from political opponents. So these torture techniques are already being developed. And next week, you'll be hearing from my colleague at the Auschwitz Institute, Jim Waller, who will talk to you about one of the making of perpetrators. And one of the things he talks about is authority orientation in countries where people have a high authority orientation, which is countries that tend to follow orders when they're given to them, tend to value people in leadership positions. They can be more susceptible to mass atrocity and genocide. Argentina has a high authority orientation, we could say, that's represented most clearly through Peronism. Maybe you've heard of Juan Perón. If you haven't heard of him, you've heard of his wife, Eva, or Evita Perón, yeah? Peronism is still today the main political movement system of Argentina, and it's characterized by populism with a really strong, charismatic and figure with almost authoritarian tendencies. That should sound maybe a little familiar to us right now. But it was represented in Argentina by Juan Domingo Perón, who started Peronism and for whom it's named. So the rise of Peronism led to the development of a disproportionately powerful executive branch. And this is a political model that is still existent in Argentina today and still causes problems. So let's talk about Perón. Perón was democratically elected. He was not a dictator in the sense that he seized power. He was democratically elected in 1946, but he rose to fame because of his role in the 1943 military government. So he was involved in one of the military juntas that came to power because of the coup, but he himself was elected democratically. He and his wife Eva, who you can see here, were extremely popular with the working class, who they called the descamisados, the shirtless ones. They were always fighting for the rights of the working class. They, in fact, expanded workers' rights. And under this regime, and largely thanks to Eva Perón, the right to vote was extended to women during this period. Eva Perón died of cancer in 1952 at the end of Perón's first term, but he was elected for a second term that same year, overwhelmingly. But all throughout this period, he was incredibly disliked by the elites, the economic elites, because they were constantly working to remove him from power, because he was too favorable to the working class and not to their own pockets. So ultimately, Perón was displaced by another military coup in 1955. And during that coup, he was forced into exile. And he would be gone for 17 years from Argentina. And during that period, Peronism as a political party was outlawed in Argentina. Now, during that 17-year period of his exile, a lot of crazy, important and crazy things were happening in the world, but also in Latin America. I mean, the biggest thing that's happening in the world during this period, 1955 and onward, the Cold War is really reaching, getting its engines rolling, right? So the world is divided into this binary of pro-communist and pro-capitalist, and Latin America, because of the Cuban Revolution during this period, Latin America becomes this battleground between those opposing sides as more and more leftist and guerrilla groups start to take control in Latin America and try to fight for the rise of communism in Latin America. In Argentina, there were two of those groups that were really important. The first is the Montoneros, which you see on the left here. They were a pro-Perón leftist faction. And on the right is the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, the People's Revolutionary Army, and that was an anti-Peronist leftist faction. So you can see that Peronism isn't necessarily lined up with the left or the right in the way that we think of politics in the US. There are conservative Peronists and liberal Peronists, and we'll see that when we talk about in a few minutes the return of Perón. So both of these groups are fighting for the rise of communism in Argentina. They're both using armed weapons to do it at times, right? So again, we got the situation of disorder, social disorder happening within the country. The military dictatorship of 1966 to 73 collapses, and Perón is allowed to return to Argentina. And this is a big moment. And all of these descamisados, the working class, thinks that their hero is coming back to them. And the Montoneros, this leftist group, thinks their hero is coming back to them. But it's a very different Perón who returns, because he's been spending his exile in Spain with Franco and all of these things, yes? So a different Perón returns, and he actually turns against the Montoneros, the pro-Peronist faction. And when he flies into Ezeiza airport in Buenos Aires, he orders an attack of the Montoneros. This is still known today as the Ezeiza massacre, and it's still a moment that looms large in the collective memory of Argentinian society. Perón is quickly re-elected president. He has his new wife now, Maria Estela Martinez, but everyone calls her Isabelita, which is a little bit of a pejorative nickname for her, Little Isabel. Yeah, and they begin, and these two, and she becomes the vice president. And they begin together fighting the rise of these leftist groups in Argentina. He dies in 1974, less than a year after he returns to power. And this creates a huge power vacuum, because when you've got a whole movement named after you, what happens when you die? There's no one immediately there to take control. Huge power vacuum. Isabelita becomes the president, and she tries to fill that power vacuum by going even harder against the left. And she creates the AAA, the Argentinian Anti-Communist Alliance, which is this group that was formed under democracy in Argentina, but that started the work of disappearing political opponents. So this is something that's really important to know, that disappearances actually started during the democratic period in Argentina. But the military still didn't think that she was being hard enough, even though during this period, basically all of the armed groups got wiped out completely. And there were no more guerrilla fights happening within Argentina because they got almost completely wiped out. So, but she wasn't strong enough according to the army, so the army, with the support of the United States and other Latin American countries in the region who were all going through similar processes, supported the military to perform another coup. And this is the one we're talking about mostly today. This took place on March 24th, 1976, and this is where it began the process of national reorganization. This was a process of eliminating completely anyone deemed to be a political subversive or a leftist from Argentinian society. It's often referred to as the dirty war, but that's actually a term that the military coined and promoted because it made it seem like it was an equal, like a battle being fought by two sides, and it sort of obscures the very one-sided nature of the violence and oppression because, as I said, all of the military groups had basically been wiped out at this point, so the violence was quite one-sided. This military coup was intimately connected with the introduction of neoliberal economic politics. Hirschberg and Rosen say that neoliberalism is the opening of Latin America's economies to foreign investment and trade by way of privatization of public activity, deregulation of private activity, and production primarily for export and fiscal austerity. It's an incredibly laissez-faire form of government and an economic system with as few regulations as possible. And indeed, they very much succeeded in installing this sort of system within Argentina. What forms of oppression and repression, then, did the military junta use to install this economic regime? Here you see a picture of, on the right, it's Videla, who was the first president of the military junta. He was in charge of the army. And this is Macera. He was in charge of the navy, and he ran one of the largest torture and concentration centers during this period. What did they do when they came to power? Congress was closed. Political parties and labor unions were banned. The Supreme Court was removed. Universities and media outlets were tightly controlled and censored. And there was a national curfew put in place where no one could be out after, I think it was 8 o'clock at night. You had to be home by then. Which, if any of you has been to Argentina, they have dinner at 11 o'clock. So this is, that on its own is a crime. The violence of the dictatorship, though, was also reflected in the really most basic aspects of daily life. Diana Taylor, former professor of mine, says the physical semiology of the population changed as the oppressive regime required identity to be performed differently in the public sphere. So this is a photo from an educational pamphlet that was handed out by the military regime during this period. And it says, así sí, así no, like this, not like this. So you've got like this very well-coiffed couple here on this side. This is how everyone's supposed to look during this period versus this sort of like, free-wheeling hippies over here, right? This said, along with this, there were texts that said males had to wear short hair, ears visible, no beard, classic trousers, jacket, shirt, and tie. Females, hair pulled back, white apron covering shirt, blouse or sweater, shirt buttoned at the neck or white undershirt. If trousers are worn, they must be navy blue, no makeup. For both sexes, it is prohibited to wear blue jeans or colored clothing under aprons. During this period, one could be arrested for dressing the wrong way, for saying anything against the regime, for having the wrong book. So for instance, if you were reading Marx for school, even if you weren't a follower of Marx in any way, that book on its own was evidence of your subversiveness. If you associated with the wrong people, you could be deemed as subversive and disappeared. So Hannah Arendt talks about during totalitarian regimes, there's this rise of what she calls the ubiquity of the informant. This idea that the person who could inform on you could be anyone, is everywhere. So you have to be careful where you are, like who you talk to, what you say everywhere, because that person could be the one that turns you in. The main tactic of violence, both symbolic and physical violence that they were using, was the disappearance. Disappearance was, what happened was you could be walking down the street in broad daylight. A car would drive up with plainclothes, undercover officers, military police officers. They usually drove Ford Falcons, so the Ford still has a very bad name in Argentina today. They would come out of the car, take you in broad daylight, throw you into the back of the car, drive off, and your friends and family would never see or hear from you again. Sometimes they would come to your house too, and they would take all of your possessions or your family's possessions as they took you. The term disappearance actually came because Videla, the president of the regime, said when he asked what happened to these people, where are these people? His response was, no están ni vivos ni muertos, están desaparecidos. They are neither alive nor dead. They are disappeared. So they're existing in this completely in-between space. And of course, that in-between space wasn't just of the people being disappeared themselves, but also their families, who were trying to seek out and find where are these family members of ours who we have no idea if they're alive or dead. Disappearance is an inherently affective strategy. It's attacking and trying to terrorize the entire population because it wasn't just affecting the person being disappeared, right? It affected everyone who witnessed those disappearances. It was terrorizing and destabilizing everyone and making them think, I need to fall in line or else that could happen to me. Diana Taylor says, the military spectacle made people pull back in fear, denial, and tacit complicity from the show of force. Therein lay its power. The military violence could have been relatively invisible, as the term disappearance suggests. The fact that it wasn't indicates that the population as a whole was its intended target. What happened to the people when they were disappeared? When someone was disappeared, they were taken to one of nearly 500 clandestine detention and torture centers that were spread all over the country. So this map right here has dots showing all of the places within Argentina where there were maps. On the far left, that's just within the city of Buenos Aires, 43 just in the center, just in the city of Buenos Aires. These centers would range from, some of them were private houses, some were police stations. The largest, ESMA, was the Navy training school, and it was operating as a Navy training school with cadets at the same time as it was a torture center and detention center. At these centers, the officers would use techniques that they learned from the United States at the School of the Americas, which was a school run and operated by the United States, at that time in Panama City, Panama, along the Panama Canal, where military officers from around Latin America would come there and learn torture techniques to use for questioning these individuals and getting more information out of them. The School of the Americas still exists. We still have it. Now it's in Georgia, in Bennett, Georgia, I believe, and it's called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, but it still exists today. Prisoners would be tortured using beatings, electric shock, and also more horrific and primitive forms of torture almost. For instance, people would be buried up to their neck in dirt, and then insects and biting ants or something would be made to crawl over their faces. Women were raped at a large scale. They would call this process questioning, trying to get them to name names of other subversives. Prisoners were also forced to perform slave labor during this period. One of the most common forms of slave labor is that they would be forced to make false documents that then the military would use to support the claims of what happened to you or to other subversives, or to forge evidence that other people were subversives. So it was actually making the prisoners participate in this cycle of violence. Around 500 of the people who were disappeared were pregnant women. They were pregnant at the time of their disappearance. Those babies, they would keep the women alive until the time that she gave birth. They actually had doctors on site who would monitor the torture so that they would take the torture just to the edge, torture the woman just to the edge of her death. And then the doctor would say, you have to stop now, and the doctor would revive the woman so that she could give birth to the baby. And then the babies were given to military families or families that supported the military who couldn't have children or who wanted more children, and they raised those kids as their own without telling them at all where they came from. When they felt like they had gotten all the information they wanted from these prisoners, the victims would be stripped naked, drugged with a sedative, and then flown in airplanes or helicopters over, if they were in Buenos Aires, over the River Plate, the large river that the city borders. And then they would be thrown into the water where they would drown. Now, why did they use this form of torture? They actually did this because they were in collaboration throughout this entire period with the Catholic Church. Argentina is still today a very Catholic country. The Pope is from Argentina. So they went to the church and said, how can we kill these people that we have in detention but not have the sin of murder on our souls? And the church said, well, if you drug them and then throw them in the water, you're not the one killing them, because the fact that they're not swimming is the reason that they die. So this is why they use this technique. And the bodies are still being found today on the riverbanks in this river. I'll talk more about that. So to this point, I've attempted to paint a picture for you of this physical, social, and affective violence of the dictatorship. You've seen how the worst of the atrocities were preceded by a long line of contributing factors, how this violence didn't just emerge overnight. And now I want to focus on the other side of that process, the long journey of addressing the resident violence of this genocide. And as you'll see, this process in Argentina was not an easy one. Neither was it one that proceeded inevitably forward. It had a number of fits and starts, both progressions and regressions. And indeed, the work of responding to the past violence is not yet over. It still preoccupies contemporary politics in Argentina. But what is particularly fascinating about Argentina that makes it unlike some of the other cases that maybe you've heard about this semester is the number of groups that emerged even within the period of the dictatorship to resist and respond to the horrific violence taking place around them. As much as the military junta really tried to silence the voice of the people during this period, they did not fully succeed. Several very important groups emerged to denounce the dictatorship publicly and fight against it at great risk to themselves. And here, the role of the survivors and families of victims played a massive role in this movement in Argentina. The most important and most famous are the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. This is a group of women whose children were disappeared. They first met at the Ministry of the Interior, where they were all filing claims to find out what happened to their children. So they met in 1977, so less than a year after the dictatorship began. And then they started meeting at each other's houses because they started figuring out that the same thing was happening to other women's children. And then on the 30th of April, 1977, 14 of these mothers, originally it was 14, met in the Plaza de Mayo, which is the central square of Buenos Aires. It's a site that has incredible symbolic significance in Argentina. One, it's the site where Argentina declared its independence from Spain. But also, next to this, there are three important buildings next to this plaza. First, the presidential palace, the Casa Rosada, the pink house, is right in front of it. So the National Bank and the National Cathedral. So you've got the centers of power, the symbolic centers of power for the political power, financial power, and religious or clerical power, which are the three regimes that are all collaborating in some way during this regime. So this is one of the reasons they chose this site. They first went there and just stood still, but then the police told them that they couldn't just stay still. There was actually a law against standing still in public space. You always had to be in movement because if you were standing still, you could potentially be collaborating with other people. So they started walking around the central column. And then they decided we shouldn't call it walking because we're doing something with a purpose. We have a goal, so we're calling it marching. So they started marching around the central column, and their numbers grew and grew and grew over the weeks. If the police demanded papers of any one of them, then every single mother there would rush over to them and demand that he take all of their papers. So it became a really difficult or nearly impossible to process all of those people. Some of them were disappeared as well, but the biggest strategy of the military was the government referred to them as las locas, the crazy ladies. And they tried to downplay their power by just calling them crazy and women, right? They were trying to say they're just housewives, crazy housewives. They don't have any power. They started wearing white scarves to identify each other. They actually, at first, they weren't scarves. They were pañuelos. They were diapers, like cloth diapers for kids, because they said it marked them as mothers. And this became a thing that the mothers still wear today, these pañuelos. And their slogan was "Aparición con vida." We want them, bring them back alive. They continue to refuse to acknowledge the death of their children. Even to this day, they refuse to acknowledge that they are dead. And they still march today every Thursday in the Plaza de Mayo. Another important group is a subset of the mothers, the abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers. These were also mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, right? But they were specifically the ones whose daughters were kidnapped when they were pregnant. So they were also demanding the return of their grandchildren, who they were suspecting were born in captivity. I'm going to return to this group later. Ultimately, the work of all of these civil society groups started to dismantle the power of the military junta. But the real linchpin that brought an end to things was the Malvinas or Falkland Islands War. The Falkland Islands are these two islands off the coast of Argentina. The Argentinians refer to them as Las Malvinas. The military invaded the Falkland Islands in April of 1982 as a populist move to reclaim them for Argentina, because they said there's no way that the British are going to send their navy to defend these islands in the middle of nowhere that's so far from Britain, right? And they had great public support for doing this. There were even mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in the public square celebrating the invasion of the Malvinas. So it was a very complicated moment of Argentinian history. They didn't think the British would react. It was a severe miscalculation because Margaret Thatcher sent the full might of the British Navy, and within 2 months, Argentina had lost the war, and the confidence in the dictatorship was completely destroyed. So at that point, it was really only a matter of months before the junta had to step down. It had lost all power and authority. There were democratic elections held on the 30th of October, 1983, and Raúl Alfonsín, who you see here, was inaugurated on December 10th, 1983, as the democratically elected president, bringing an end to over 6.5 years of dictatorship. And Alfonsín, in these moments, began the first official governmental efforts to address the violence of the dictatorship. He began his presidency with widespread public support, but with a military that was indeed still incredibly strong. There was still great risk. There was a threat that another coup could still happen. That threat had not dissolved. But despite this fact, Alfonsín began a revolutionary strategy of what today we call transitional justice, these mechanisms for dealing with the past. At the time, we didn't have that term. The term didn't exist because Argentina was making it up in the moment. They had the first Truth Commission was from Argentina. Within 10 days of Alfonsín entering office, he created a National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONADEP. And the following year, the report of this Truth Commission was published. It was called Nunca Más, Never Again. And it became an instant bestseller. And that's when people started finding out the realities of exactly what had taken place during the dictatorship. The report told of the disappearance, torture, and murder of almost 9,000 individuals. Today, the figures are much clearer and much more. We think that there are around 30,000 people who were disappeared, around 500 clandestine detention centers, as I said, around 500 children who were illegally appropriated, born in captivity, and given to military families to raise, roughly 40,000 people forced into exile, hundreds of businesses were co-opted and then shut down by the regime. Even given this Truth Commission and its findings, the military still refused to drop their party line, and even today, the military exists within a cone of silence. They still won't talk. They won't rat out anyone else. No one will acknowledge anything that happened during this period, despite all of the evidence that proves it. But this wasn't just a period of truth. It was also a period of justice. In 1985, the Alfonsine government put the top 9 orchestrators of the crimes of the dictatorship on trial. This was the first time since the Nuremberg trials that a democratic government tried that the leaders of this sort of regime of crime were tried, and it was the first time in the world that it had been done domestically, completely domestically, that the country itself put their own former leaders on trial. They made a deliberate decision not to try rank and file perpetrators because of the threat from the military. They only tried the architects during this junta trials, it's called. Videla and Macera, the 2 men I pointed out earlier, they were both sentenced to life in prison. 3 others were given extended prison sentences, and 4 of them were acquitted. After the close of these trials, though, further justice began to seem impossible. There were several new attempted military coups. One of them nearly succeeded. There was almost another military dictatorship in Argentina because of the trials and the military's anger at them. So these political realities and the military threat led to a huge transformation away from these revolutionary measures of transitional justice and dealing with the past to what is often referred to as Argentina's period of impunity. As I said, the process of responding to and transforming resonant violence in Argentina was not a short one, and it underwent a series of steps forward and backward. But this period of impunity marks the biggest and longest step backward when it comes to the state's own measures for dealing with the past. This impunity was institutionalized through a series of laws that were passed to basically make it impossible to try any further perpetrators. The first law was passed in 1986. It was called the Full Stop Law. And this said, after 60 days from the passage of this law, no more cases can be brought against for crimes perpetrated during this period. This law had a backwards effect. It had the exact opposite effect of what they wanted, because basically it meant that everyone tried to get their cases submitted before the 60-day period was over. So the court system got flooded with cases, with claims. So they passed another law in 1987 called the Law of Due Obedience, and this law stated that no one could be tried or convicted if they could be proven that they were just following orders. So because all of the architects had already been tried, this basically meant that it was impossible for anyone else to be convicted of crimes during this period of time. And these 2 laws were made even stronger in 1990 when Carlos Menem was elected president. Menem was a more to the right, more conservative president. He advocated forgetting about the past completely, about moving forward. He wanted to destroy all the former concentration centers, and rather than marking them or leaving them as evidence even for future trials, because he didn't see trials happening. And on Christmas Eve of 1990, right after he was elected president, he granted a full presidential pardon to all participants in the dictatorship, and that included those who were already tried and in prison. So those architects got released from prison when he granted this pardon. But even though the state had totally absconded from responsibility for the crimes of the past during the late 80s and 90s, ordinary citizens, particularly the family members of the victims and other civil society organizations, did not. Even during this period of impunity, forces outside of the government continued to work hard and fight against forgetting, for memory, and for the return of justice. So the grandmothers kept searching for their grandchildren, the mothers kept marching for their children's return, and in the same way that the grandmothers give birth to the mothers and the mothers to children, a new generation of activists also came of age during this period, and these were the children of the disappeared. So these are kids, children, not children necessarily, like 18 to 25, around your age, right? Many of your age. And they formed their own organization called Hijos. Hijos in Spanish means sons, or sons and daughters, right? But it was an acronym that stood for Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice, Against Forgetting and Silence. This was a group that was formed in the city of Cordoba by about 70 sons and daughters of disappeared during Easter week of 1995, so almost exactly 23 years ago this week. And within months, It included over 350 members in 14 cities around Argentina. And the biggest contribution by far that this group made to the world and to Argentina was the unique brand of activism that they developed to respond to the realities of that time. And it was an activist practice called the escrache. The escrache is this unique form of public activism developed by hijos to respond specifically to the lack of formal justice, to the reality that all of these perpetrators were living free amongst the people of Argentina. The word comes from the Spanish verb escrachar, which means like to uncover something or to bring something to light, and that's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to bring to light all of the people who had perpetrated crimes during the dictatorship, but were living free and unpunished in Argentinian society. And because the government wasn't going to give them a formal sentence, a judicial, a formal type of justice, they created what they called a condena social, or a social sentencing that they wanted to levy against the perpetrators. The escrache itself was a really loud theatrical event. It would start by all of these members of the escrache meeting in a public square or somewhere in the neighborhood where the perpetrator lived. And then they would all march through the street to the house of that perpetrator that they had chosen for the escrache that week or month. There would be singing, puppet shows, chanting. It was a very colorful theatrical event. It wasn't an angry event, actually. It was actually they tried to make it really carnivalesque and theatrical. When they would get to, they would do really sort of ironic or darkly comic things. So this is there's a gate there that the police were standing in front of. So sometimes they would dangle pizza boxes on fishing poles over the gate and chant things like, "Oh, you would kill your own mother for a slice of pizza." They were really trying to rework how protests function in Argentina. They would then throw these paint bombs, like paint-filled balloons, on the house of the perpetrator, and on the side or on the pavement in front of the house, they would paint like, "Here hides a free genocidaire," and then his name. So the whole house would be marked, so no one could not notice that this was a house where a perpetrator was living. I'm going to show you now a brief video that will show you what the escrache looked like. This is an escrache for a perpetrator named Luis Donosik, and this took place in 2002. So yeah, you'll see that now.
Y Donosik, ya estás escrachado. Aunque tapes tu casa con esta triste lona verde militar, el repudio del barrio no lo vas a poder tapar. Porque mientras los vecinos usan el toldo para protegerse del sol, vos lo usás para seguir ocultándote. Pero ya es tarde, te llegó la hora del escrache, Donosik. Si no hay justicia, hay escrache. Vida libre, Donosik. No olvidamos, no perdonamos, no nos reconciliamos. 30.000 compañeros detenidos desaparecidos. ¡Presentes! ¡Ahora y siempre! ¡Ahora y siempre! ¡Ahora y siempre!
Great. So you get a little taste of what the escrache was like. I'm going to skip this slide. The escrache was a deeply planned process. It didn't just happen spontaneously. They put a lot of effort into planning it. So it would start about a month to a month and a half before the escrache began, when members of the group would go into the neighborhood and work with people in the neighborhood to paint murals and things on public walls. There's a big history of street art in Argentina. So this was using something that people were already doing at the time. And it would announce that there's going to be an escrache in the neighborhood, which basically meant there's a free perpetrator living amongst you. This is another little graffiti that they use that is the slogan of hijos: si no hay justicia, hay escrache. If there's no justice, there will be escrache. And this is basically their promise to continue making the escrache until the government started putting the perpetrators on trial again. They would create these flyers with all of the information of so they did a lot of research to make sure that the person that they were doing the escrache against was a confirmed perpetrator. They would make these flyers that had all of the acts that he committed during the dictatorship, along with his name, photo, and I say his because it was always a man, his name, his photograph, address, and telephone number, and then the information about when the escrache would take place. They would hand these out to people or put them in mailboxes. They worked with a group called Grupo de Arte Callejero, or a street artist group, that they made these street signs that look like real street signs, but then like this one, for instance, says, 100 meters from here is Ernesto Fremont Weber, a perpetrator of genocide, and then his address. So it's appropriating the language of the state almost in the street signs to do this thing that the state wasn't doing, namely putting them on trial. All of this, the ultimate goal of the escrache was, as I said, to levy what they called a condena social, a social sentence. And this is what they meant by a social sentence is described really well by Julieta. She was a 28-year-old member of Hijos. Her father, aunt, and uncle were all disappeared, and this is how she explains it. Given the absence of a legal sentence, there must exist a social sentence. What we pursue is that the perpetrator's own house becomes his jail, that his own neighborhood and neighbors sentence him in the daily things in his daily life. The social sentence makes the baker decide not to sell him bread any longer, the taxi driver not to take him. We want him and his past to stop being a mystery to the neighborhood. So this is the idea of what they mean by the social sentence. The most recognized slogan of Hijos, as I said, is, if there's no justice, there will be escrache. And Julieta really demonstrates here how the escrache was more than an act of protest. It was actually performing the act of judgment that the state was refusing to perform. The escrache represented the issuing of a social sentence that then must be carried out by the people of the neighborhood. So the performance of the escrache was really only the beginning of a much larger process in which Hijos themselves didn't take part. And this process of condemnation was left to those most directly affected by the presence of the perpetrator, his neighbors. Hijos was then just drawing this line in the sand almost that divided this criminal from the rest of the community, and then it was then up to the members of the community to decide on which side of that line they were going to stand. The escrache is also an example of a practice of transmission, because first, Hijos is nothing if not a beautiful example of the intergenerational transmission of affect, of memory, and of trauma. For one, Hijos is a direct byproduct of the civil disobedience of the mothers and the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Oftentimes, the intergenerational transmission of trauma is theorized as a painfully unavoidable byproduct of mass violence, right? The legacy of the pain that subsequent generations must endure. But here, we see another side of that coin. While, of course, it would be much better for the initiating violence never to have taken place in Argentina, the transmission of memory in this case has led to a level of human rights activism that might never have existed. So this transmission of traumatic memory has led to new understandings of agency, which is being exercised by Hijos here in ways that at times mirrors the acts of the mothers and the grandmothers, but at other times contributes to new sources of intersubjective power that were previously unheard of. But maybe even more importantly, the transmission of memory is what leads to the transformation of the negative affect of that memory. In the face of the damaging affective force of resonant violence, which operates to destroy the collective voice of the people and to push people out of the public sphere, Hijos represents a reversal of that force. By refusing to break apart and experience the pain of intergenerational traumatic memory in silence and in isolation, the negative affect is actually transformed into something else, into what Diana Taylor calls the engine for cultural change. This sentiment was really confirmed for me when I had a conversation with one high-ranking member of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, Tati Almeida, when I asked her about what moved her to her political activism in the face of the pain of losing her own son. Her response, and this is a quote, she said, "Actually, that pain, that rage, what they did to us did not leave us with hate. No, we transformed it into love for our children and into a fight, a peaceful fight." The co-embodied practices of the mothers and the Hijos do not just transmit the memory of the violent past, but they transform it into something altogether different, more positive, and potentially preventive of future violence. Hijos lived up to their word. They continued making escraches against the former perpetrators into the early 2000s, but ultimately, they didn't have to continue the escraches for much longer because things changed in Argentina. There was a huge economic crash in 2001, a meltdown of the Argentinian economy, and along with that economic meltdown, there was a real dissatisfaction with the government and the state, leading the country into a political chaos. And after several elections and during 1 week, there were 6 presidents during 1 week right after this economic crisis. It was a crazy time. In 2003, Nestor Kirchner was elected president. This is him with his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who would actually become president for 2 terms after his death. And they ushered in an era, well, he really ushered in an era of what's often called justice in full. It was a radically different economic agenda that responded to the neoliberal policies of the 90s that got Argentina into this crisis to begin with. But he also worked with the courts to nullify the 2 laws, the full stop and the law of due obedience. And he had the presidential pardons declared unconstitutional. So because of that, it paved the way for reopening trials against the perpetrator, and those trials began again in 2005. Today, Argentina engages in the past actively with a 3-pronged approach of truth, justice, and memory. Well over 1,000 perpetrators have been brought to trial, with over 500 receiving sentences. The most recent trials ended in November of last year. Those were trials of people who were involved in the death flights, where people were dropped into the river. 29 perpetrators were sentenced during those trials last November. Financial reparations have been paid to the family members of victims. The state has developed numerous policies to support victims and their families in other ways, including counseling, scholarships, other forms of mental health assistance. Argentina developed a team of forensic anthropologists who have been diligently doing the work of uncovering the bodies of the disappeared in the riverbeds mostly, and are in mass graves, and they continue to do this work. They've uncovered the remains of thousands of these disappeared to be able to return those remains to their families. And the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, interestingly, they were one of the first groups in the world to take advantage of DNA technology, and they created a DNA bank, so all of them gave their blood to the bank so that anyone who suspected that they could be a potential child of that was appropriated could have their DNA tested and found out if they belonged to one of the grandmother's families. All of these things really contribute to an active culture of memory in Argentina. All of these achievements I've mentioned, the trials, reparations, the recovery of appropriated children, are examples of what can happen in a society that actively recognizes and deals with the past human rights violations. Now, I want to put in a little asterisk here because right now things are a little not so cheery in Argentina. The most recent, there's a new president who was elected in 2015, Mauricio Macri, and his regime has not necessarily followed through with a lot of the policies of the previous regimes. There's been a real backstep in the human rights movement, a regression in these policies, a rise in denialism related to the violence of the dictatorship, a rise in the discourse of moving on and not talking so much about the past, and also a focus on economic development over human rights. And really, unfortunately, there's been a very large uptick in police violence in protests, particularly indigenous rights protests. And there was even one disappearance last year. The police abducted one protester during an indigenous rights protest, and we still don't know what happened to him. But the comprehensive work of confronting resident violence is still also visible in more symbolic practices, even if the state isn't following through with these needs, that demonstrate how dedicated people can ensure that the past remains active in the present so that it prevents the return of such violence in the future. The mothers are still marching every Thursday. The grandmothers still searching for their grandchildren. 125 grandchildren have been reappropriated at this point. One of the most important examples of how Argentina's relationship to its past has changed can be seen in the transformation of ESMA, which was the largest concentration camp. In 2004, President Kirchner took it back from the military and turned it into a site of memory. Here you can see him having the portrait of Videla, the dictator, taking down from the wall, a very important symbolic moment. and that site was declared as a site of memory. Today, it contains over 30 buildings. It's a 42-acre site, and it's been transformed into a space to remember the past. You can, in this one building, only one of those 30 buildings was where the actual torture was taking place, and that site has been preserved and is a site of memory that you can tour to learn more about the violence of the past. One of the other buildings they transformed into a cultural center for memory. This center, there are art exhibitions, theatrical performances, concerts, dance, academic conferences. They're all free and open to the public. The only thing is they have to have something to do with memory as a theme. And the other buildings were given to civil society organizations as their headquarters. So this one was transformed into the National Memory Archive, which keeps testimony of victims and survivors and their kin. This is a center, an after-school center for children created by the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, where they teach kids after school about human rights. I'll end with this one last thing. One of the organizations housed within ESMA hosted one particularly vibrant group practice in 2008 on the 30th anniversary of the 1978 World Cup final, which was held at the Club River Plate soccer stadium, which is only about 1 mile from ESMA. So the people who were imprisoned at ESMA at this time, the prisoners who survived say that they could hear the cheers from the stadium of this World Cup finale happening. This match is also really important because the military dictatorship was using the Argentina hosting the World Cup as a way of presenting to the world that, no, everything's okay. Look at how we can host this World Cup match. We can think maybe about the Olympics or the World Cup in Russia right now. So this public exaltation surrounding the World Cup did a great deal in distracting the world and Argentina's soccer-loving population from the massive political violence happening around them. So in response to this event, and in honor of the disappeared, one group within ESMA hosted what they called La Otra Final, the other final, the match for life and human rights. It was a symbolic soccer match to remember the 30,000 disappeared. Thousands of people gathered in ESMA, and many members of the mothers, grandmothers, and children, hijos. They unfurled a banner with the pictures of the disappeared, all the ones that they know, and it went for several city blocks. And they marched out of ESMA, carrying it out of ESMA, and into the soccer stadium, River Plate Stadium, about a mile away. Many others joined this parade along the way. There was a large section of the stadium that you can see here that was cordoned off and no one sat there. And it says 30,000 detained, disappeared, present. They're here with us. There was also the box seats, which is where the military junta sat during the dictatorship, during the World Cup match. That was also cordoned off as a sign of condemnation. 2 teams played an exhibition match, 2 25-minute halves. The teams had a variety of players. 3 players were from the 1978 national team. There were also ex-political prisoners and detainees, children of several families that went into exile during the dictatorship, and the National Youth Under-20 Soccer League. The match was broadcast live on TV and radio. It ended in a 1-1 tie, which was nice. There was a concert also where several well-known and well-respected musicians performed for the crowd. So it was really about mixing the pain of the past and the joy of Argentina's national pastime. This experience is one that many people described as an exorcism of the demons of the past. I'm going to end by calling on another voice, not my own, another medium for conveying this story of Argentina. When the participants of La Otra Final entered the stadium, Argentinian musician Daniel Villetti, who you see here, was playing a song, the lyrics of which come from Uruguayan poet Circe Maya. The song is called Otra Voz Canta, or This song, which was written as a tribute to the disappeared, stresses that the dead are not dead at all. Their voices call out, saying that they are still alive, that they have not been lost. In an emotional transposition of words, Viglietti says that the disappeared sing with him, but also that they sing through him, through his body. They sing with me they sing. Similarly, L'Otra Final, the other final, is an example of a practice that re-embodies the disappeared, making them present, both through highlighting their absence through the empty stands that were reserved for them, and by symbolically carrying them out of the place of their torture and death to a place of joy. They were unable to celebrate with their fellow Argentinians as their team won the World Cup championship in 1978. But now there's another final being played, just like there's another voice singing. And this one is especially for them. This staging of conflicting emotions serves as a means for transforming the resonant violence of the past into the productive force of a collective stand against such violence in the present. Through a collective embodied practice, a spectacular display of joy and commitment, a place with a troubling history is expunged of its guilt, its dirty past. It again becomes a place for community and passionate living. In other words, participants convert the enduring effects of resonant violence into new and vibrant sources of power and agency. Thanks so much. So if anyone has any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah. I have to turn this off.
I've got a two-part question. So at the beginning, you explained that even though Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide, it makes Argentina's case fit, the legal definition, this doesn't fit that. So my first question is, in similar cases to what happened in Argentina, what can the international community do if legally, like cases like this don't fit the legal definition? And then is part of that we need to expand the legal definition, or is there something more than that that we should be doing?
Is this one? Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. The definitions surrounding genocide are always a really complicated and debatable subject. I don't think, even though I, in my academic work, use a much broader definition of genocide than the legal definition, I don't think that necessarily the legal definition needs to be changed because there are plenty of tools still available, even if in the cases like Argentina where the definition doesn't, where the groups are not protected by the legal definition. So for instance, legally speaking, there isn't a distinction between our hierarchy between genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Those three, legally speaking, there's no hierarchy between those, even though we typically think of genocide as the crime of crimes, the worst of all crimes. There's no debate over the fact that what happened in Argentina was a crime against humanity. There were crimes against humanity happening in Argentina. So genocide tends to be a denomination that's really important for victim groups and their families especially, but legally speaking, not necessarily as important. There are plenty of legal avenues to pursue, even if genocide isn't possible because the protected group wasn't included.
You mentioned that the Catholic Church not only okayed the disappearance, but acted complicitly in the death of thousands of people. And I was just wondering how that was addressed in Argentina and the rest of the world.
That's also a really important question. One of the really important and saddest moments of during the dictatorship, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo raised money to go to Rome to have an audience with the Pope to try and ask for his help. And importantly, like the mothers were holding out their note to try and get an audience with the Pope. And in a moment that they still talk about today, the Pope let that note fall to the ground. So the Catholic Church has not been good about addressing its complicity in a lot of genocides, including the Holocaust, right? They've recently opened up some of their Holocaust archives, which is a really important step. there hasn't necessarily been that level of opening up around their complicity in violence, not only in Argentina, but also almost every country in Latin America was experiencing, if not the same, similar levels of violence and military dictatorship during this period, and the church was complicit in many of those. There hasn't been a lot of opening up, and there also hasn't been a ton of pressure to make them open up. So, but yeah, the state and the military side of things has definitely been focused on much more than the church involvement and complicity.
So this might be a little confusing of a question, but first I wanted to say that I really liked how you defined rescuers in the beginning of the presentation as those who are rescuing the past from oblivion. And I was just wondering that, like, was the resistance and like the activism in this whole process of rescuing the past, did it influence any other like any other countries' citizens to be this resistant to forgetting the past? Because I'm thinking of like the U.S. history with indigenous people and how there isn't really much resistance to it, in the sense of it being something that is as big as this. Like, yes, there are people who are also resisting, but it's minimal in the sense of how popularized it is, and like, and I guess like public opinion.
The activist movements in Argentina absolutely had a large impact, not just in Argentina, but also around the world. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo are probably one of the most famous human rights activist groups that still to this day, and their activism inspired a lot of other activist groups. So for instance, the Women in Black is a really famous worldwide group of women in places like Serbia, Bosnia, Israel, I mean, really places all over the world that are fighting for an end to conflict, really broadly speaking. And they were inspired by the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Of course, they're their own institution as well. The Escrache is a form of activism that has now been sort of traveled around the world. In this age of globalization, activist movements also cross borders. So it's been used both in the region, and now it was used a lot in Spain, but not to denounce perpetrators, to denounce economic institutions after particularly after the 2008 financial crisis. So these things change and transpose and stuff too. Regarding the tie-in that you're making with indigenous activism, this is another case that I've worked on, and a lot of my focus has been on the indigenous rights movements in the 1960s and 70s, which was a huge upswell in Native American rights activism in the US, and the impact of that activism that started with probably the occupation of Alcatraz Island and ended around the time in 1978 with the Longest Walk, this sort of reverse recreation of the Trail of Tears, is not to be overstated. It was incredibly, and what is interesting now is I think that we're seeing a rebirth in that with the sorts of activism happening around Standing Rock, and it will be really, and not to say that the activism disappeared, but I think a lot of public attention in the activism disappeared, and it'll be interesting to see how, if the public attention will return again to indigenous rights activism now, as I think it definitely warrants. But yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about the that first Truth Commission, and maybe why you didn't actually outright say that it failed, but what I gathered from the presentation was that it didn't have the long-term effect that they were hoping until many years later, when there was kind of a redo when civil society demanded that there was some accountability. So I'm wondering, maybe if you could critique that Truth Commission or talk a little bit about? I don't even know if the class as a whole knows what Truth Commissions are, how they work, and so on. And maybe tell us about that one a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. So I definitely don't think the Truth Commission failed. I think it was an incredibly important moment in Argentinian history and world history, because as I said, it was the first Truth Commission we know about in the world, that really, in the way that we think about Truth Commissions today. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, Truth Commissions are this mechanism of what we call transitional justice now, which is basically just a weird name for talking about how societies deal with the past, how they deal with the human rights abuses that took place during a period of authoritarian or oppressive regimes. A Truth Commission, it's interesting because when we think about a lot of the big cases of genocide today, we have so much information about them. We know very well exactly what the violence looked like and how it functioned in the Holocaust. We know now about how it functioned in Argentina and Bosnia and Rwanda. The fact that we know so much about it now sort of obscures the fact that in the midst of that violence and in the immediate aftermath, we didn't know as much as we know now. That information was not always there. So oftentimes one of the first things that needs to happen in a post-atrocity society is you just need to find out what exactly occurred. What was the scope and breadth of the violence that occurred in our society that was perpetrated here? Argentina came up with this novel way of doing it, which was to establish a Truth Commission, this group of several appointed individuals who interviewed survivors, family members of survivors, and also combed through all of the documentation that they could get their hands on, and then compiled a report that was published, and as I said, became a bestseller, so that the people in Argentina could, for the first time, get a very clear and accurate view about exactly what happened during that period. The Truth Commission has since then become a much more common instrument of transitional justice, and it was most famously used in South Africa after apartheid. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is still probably the one Truth Commission that people think about more than anything, because it was also a Truth Commission that was completely televised. So all of the interviews and testimony given by victims was televised, and people were able to watch it, and it's thought of as a big moment of healing and reconciliation in the South African case. Now, the crux, or the problem with it is that a Truth Commission on its own is never enough on its own. Just finding out the truth is never enough, because what happens when you find out the scale of the violence that occurred during a period? You want something to be done about it. You want there to be a response to it. So if there's just a Truth Commission and you stop there, it leaves people saying, okay, so great, you're acknowledging all this stuff happened, but you're not going to do anything to change it, to repay people for what the violence that they suffered, or to reform society so that these sorts of things can't happen again. So that's why Truth Commissions fit into this other rubric of transitional justice, where we talk about criminal trials and prosecutions, the reform of institutions, judicial reform, or reform of the security sector, the army and police forces, who are often complicit in the crimes. Or things like the construction of memorials, or the payment of reparations to groups of people. All of these things work together to rebuild and restructure societies in a way that can hopefully be preventive of future violence. The problem in the Argentinian case is the Truth Commission happened. It did lead to trials, but only trials of the first, the architects of the violence, and not any of the rank and file perpetrators. And then, because of the military and threat and the political realities, they stopped there. Nothing else happened. So for about a 15-year period, it was just Argentina was existing in this limbo where we knew about all this violence was happening and nothing else was happening. All these people were living free. So that's why when the reintroduction of this period of justice in full, the introduction of reparations payments, the construction of memorial sites and public recognition of the state's role in the violence perpetrated there, we can see that. So the Truth Commission wasn't necessarily failed, but its call was not complete. Like, a Truth Commission without follow-up feels totally incomplete. So it wasn't until those moments that the Truth Commission sort of lived out its destiny, flowered into what it was supposed to become. So the Truth Commission is just, it puts out a little, an arm out there, and then you have to take it and grow. It has to grow and become something better and bigger. Yeah.
So, based upon what you were saying about the junta, is they were opposing the left. Has the left become more acceptable in the aftermath of all these horrors? And has militarism become more rejected or less accepted?
Yeah, of course, like in the worldwide scheme, the idea of what the left has changed. During the Cold War, of course, everything became radicalized in some form. So being the left was also about, in this case especially, was about being pro-communism. Of course, there are leftists who are not pro-communism now. So the left is a much more acceptable institution, generally speaking. Of course, not to the military. The military is still overall a very conservative institution and doesn't very much like the left. And, you know, there are still people in Argentina, a small percentage, in Chile, if you go next door, an even larger percentage of people who would be, you know, they don't think too badly about the period when the military was in charge. In fact, you know, they would welcome some of the order that the military would install if they took over again today. That's still a real reality that's faced in many countries in Latin America. But no, generally speaking, Argentinian democracy is much stronger, and this left-right balance is not so stark and doesn't produce as much conflict as it did during this period. I would also say that Argentina instituted really important reforms in their military after the dictatorship. It went from being a military-run institution to being civilian-run. So that was a huge and important moment of military or security sector reform in Argentina that took away some of the power of the military and the threat of them taking control again through a coup.
We spent some time in class today talking about Operation Condor and the 5 other nations that were involved in this sort of collusion at the same time as the events in Argentina. Did this sort of justice process occur in any of the other 5 nations that were involved in Condor? And a second question, when you spoke of the Pope dropping the slip that the Madres presented for a meeting, that was John Paul II? Oh, okay, Benedict. Yes. That makes sense. And what has Francis had to say about this?
I'll take the second part first. Pope Francis is an interesting case because there are actually some people who tie him to some of the violence during the dictatorship. There is some evidence that Pope Francis he didn't order that two priests were disappeared, but there were 2 priests who were working against the military regime, and he lifted the protection of the church from them. So he basically made there's evidence to suggest that he made it known that there wouldn't be a penalty if something happened to those 2 priests. It's not proven, and he hasn't really responded to it. But of course now, Pope Francis today is, especially for the head of the Catholic Church, is someone who really is fighting for human rights and in a way that we haven't seen in the Catholic Church for many, many decades. So it's a very complicated situation. We don't totally know what his role was during the period of the dictatorship. Operation Condor and the other, as I said, Operation Condor was, all of these other countries in the regime that were also going through military dictatorships, and they were all collaborating with each other. So, which made it even harder, if you were going to be deemed as subversive and disappeared in Argentina, you couldn't just run across to Uruguay, right, or to Chile, because those governments were all colluding with Argentinian government, and they would return you, and you would, or they would imprison you themselves. So it was part of the thing that made it so difficult to escape these mechanisms of violence as well. Argentina has by far undergone the most justice procedures of all the states in Operation Condor. Chile has not really seen any major trials, though one thing, there was an important moment where Chile was a little bit of a different case because instead of it being a military junta where all of these different leaders were in charge, it was really one guy, Augusto Pinochet, was the dictator in Chile. He ran it from 1973 to 1990, the whole time. When the military regime lost power and democracy returned, they passed an impunity law that has basically been respected. And Pinochet made himself senator for life. In one important moment for justice, though, a Spanish judge used what's called universal jurisdiction, the idea that when crimes against humanity are crimes that affect and impact the entire world, and therefore it shouldn't just be Chilean courts that should be able to put Chilean perpetrators of atrocities on trial. So a warrant was issued for Pinochet's arrest out of Spain. He was arrested in London when he was on vacation there, and he was kept there for, I think, a year and a half, but ultimately not convicted. He was returned to Chile and released on the urging of Margaret Thatcher and George H.W. Bush. The U.S. was complicit in all of the military dictatorships. They knew about everything that was going on and they were very much involved with Operation Condor as well. So we have our own, and there are still CIA files that are slowly being released but have not been totally released yet that we have about our own participation in these crimes. Uruguay is another case. They have not had trials, and that's not because they didn't try. They actually had public referendums 2 times. They had public votes where they put it on the ballot. Who thinks there should be trials of the perpetrators of the dictatorship? And both times, the population said, we don't want trials, we just want to move on. So that's a really interesting and complex case. But Argentina has by far had the most, as I said, over 1,000 perpetrators on trial. The biggest of these trials just ended last November. So it's by far had the largest and most comprehensive justice process of all of the Operation Condor countries.
My question is, because of the involvement with the Vatican, wouldn't they also be able to stand trial for genocide, or are they untouchable because of who they are?
For genocide is a really complicated thing because it's more complicated than it seems because, for a number of reasons. One, the court that we have to try people for genocide internationally right now is the International Criminal Court, which was created by the Rome Statute. And it says that crimes that happen before the institution of that court can't go backwards, right? Like it can only do from 2005, or 1995, I can't remember which, onward. So already the Argentinian case will be out of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which means that the trial would have to take place within a country itself. One country would have to decide to have a trial for that. And the Vatican is its own country. They have their own jurisdiction. So it seems unlikely that there could, the biggest problem with putting anyone on trial for genocide is a lack of political will. And this is the case, the same reason that the biggest problem with intervening when genocides are taking place is really difficult, because there's a lack of political will. We have an international norm called the responsibility to protect, which says that we all have a responsibility to prevent and respond to cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Just because we all have that norm and agree to it doesn't mean that it happens. We know very well that there are atrocities happening in the world right now, and we're not responding to them. And it's not because we're not supposed to, it's because there isn't a will to respond to them. To put someone on the Vatican on trial, I think the political repercussions of doing that are much more dangerous than anyone who would, think it was right to do it. So it's all politics, unfortunately. Thank you all.